84 pages. That's everything a former president of the United States was willing to keep of the Gospels after he sat down with a razor. 6 printed copies of the New Testament, and a blank book bound in red leather, and the object he made that winter is sitting in a climate-controlled case at the Smithsonian in Washington right now, where anybody can go look at it. Thomas Jefferson was 77 years old, retired at Monticello, and he worked in 4 languages at once: Greek, Latin, French, and English, cut into strips and pasted in parallel columns so the sayings he kept could be checked against each other. He called it The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He had done a shorter version, 46 pages, back in 1804, while he was in the White House. What's not in it is the part people notice. No angel appearing to Mary, no star, no water turned into wine, no walking on the sea, no feeding of the 5,000, no voice from the cloud, and no resurrection. The book ends, you can read the last line in the facsimile the government printing office produced in 1904 with the body laid in the tomb, a great stone rolled to the door, and everybody going home. What he kept was the teaching. The Sermon on the Mount, almost whole. The parables, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, the sayings about judging and forgiving and where your treasure is. In a letter to John Adams in October of 1813, he described what he thought he was doing. The genuine sayings of Jesus, he wrote, were as easily distinguishable from what had accumulated around them as diamonds in a dunghill. Blunt man. But notice the assumption sitting inside that sentence, because the whole investigation today turns on it. He believed there was a core, that the core was moral, and that a person of ordinary judgment could tell it apart from the shell. And here's how normal this was in American public life. That Smithsonian book got printed by Congress in 1904, and for roughly the next 50 years, new members of Congress were handed a copy when they were sworn in. Not as a scandal, as a civic keepsake. So, this is not a video about one eccentric man with a knife. Jefferson was running an experiment that had already been running for 50 years before him in Germany, that was running at the same time in Calcutta, that would run through Harvard's Divinity School Chapel, through 19th century German universities, through a hotel conference room in California in the 1980s, and that runs quietly, without anybody calling it philosophy in American churches, every single Sunday. The experiment is this. Can you separate the moral heart of a religion from its history? And if you can, what exactly is the instrument you're using to make the cut? The man who wrote the manual for that operation put the answer right in the title. In 1793, in Königsberg, in the far corner of Prussia, Immanuel Kant published a book called Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, not a book against religion. A book about what's left when you ask which parts of a faith any human being could recognize as binding without having to first accept a claim about something that happened in a particular place at a particular time. We're going to follow this trail from a hidden manuscript that its author never dared publish, through the ditch that one German playwright said he could never leap across, into Kant's actual argument and the specific criterion he proposed, out to the American versions of the same operation, including 2 you have almost certainly held in your hands, and then to the sharpest objection anyone has ever raised against the whole project, which came from inside the project. And by the end, the question that matters won't be what got cut. It'll be what kept surviving the cut. If that's your kind of hour, subscribing is what keeps this channel making them, and the like button is the whole mechanism by which the next curious person finds this. Now, before we leave Monticello, you've done a small version of Jefferson's operation yourself, and probably last week. Every time a pastor works through a passage on a Sunday morning and then arrives at what he calls the application now, what this means for your life is a separation just happened. The story went one way, the moral core got lifted out and handed to you. Every study Bible with the little application notes running along the bottom of the page is doing it in print. Nobody thinks of that as radical. It's the most ordinary thing in American church life. It is also, structurally, exactly what Jefferson was doing with a razor. 50 years before Monticello, in Hamburg, a professor of Hebrew and Oriental languages named Hermann Samuel Reimarus was writing a manuscript he had no intention of publishing. He was a respectable man, taught at the city's academic high school, published on natural religion, well regarded. And in his desk, he had something that ran to roughly 4,000 pages, called Apology, or Defense for the Rational Worshippers of God. He showed it to his family and a few trusted friends. Then he died in 1768, and it stayed in the desk. What was in it was a systematic argument that the Gospels contain a layer of later interpretation laid over a much more ordinary set of events, that the disciples had one set of expectations. Those expectations collapsed, and the accounts we have were shaped afterward by people making sense of the collapse. Whether he was right about the details is a separate question, and most historians today think he got a great deal wrong. What matters is the move. He treated the texts as historical documents produced by human beings under pressure, and asked what could be established about them the way you'd establish anything else. He knew what that would cost a man, with a job and children, so he sat on it. Then Gotthold Ephraim Lessing got hold of pieces of it. Lessing was a playwright and critic working as librarian at the Ducal Library in Wolfenbüttel, and between 1774 and 1778, he published 7 excerpts, attributing them to an unnamed author whose papers he claimed to have found in the library. They landed like a brick through a window. The fight that followed took over German intellectual life for years, and in the middle of that fight, in 1777, Lessing wrote a short piece that framed the problem so precisely that theologians are still arguing with it 250 years later. He said that accidental truths of history can never become the proof of necessary truths of reason. And then the line everybody quotes, that this is the ugly, broad ditch he could not get across, however often and however earnestly he had tried to make the leap. Take a second with that, because it sounds abstract, and it isn't. Say a historian proves to your complete satisfaction that a specific man said a specific sentence on a specific afternoon in the year 30. What follows? You now know a fact about the past. Facts about the past are always, in principle, revisable. A new manuscript turns up, a dating gets corrected, an inscription gets reread. Meanwhile, the claim that cruelty is wrong doesn't feel like the kind of thing that could be overturned by an archaeologist with a trowel. Those are two different species of certainty. Lessing's ditch is the gap between them. You cannot get a necessary truth out of a contingent one, no matter how solid the contingent one is. That gap is the engine of everything that follows. Because once you've felt it, the separation experiment isn't vandalism anymore. It starts to look like a rescue. If the moral content of a religion is resting on a historical foundation, and historical foundations can always shift, then either you find something sturdier for it to rest on, or you spend your life defending the foundation. Anybody who grew up in a church and quietly noticed that the sermon's whole weight seemed to hang on whether a certain event happened exactly as described has already felt the ditch. You didn't have a German word for it. You had a feeling in your chest during a Wednesday night Bible study. Same thing. And that feeling is not a defect in your faith. It's a piece of perfectly good reasoning happening without permission. The Reimarus fight also cracked open a question that never closed: what those 4 gospel books actually are, who wrote them, and how they came to be the 4. That's its own long trail, and there's a video here on the channel called How the Gospels Were Actually Written and Chosen that walks it end to end. If you haven't sat with that one yet, it pairs with this like the other half of a hinge. Because our question today isn't how the books got made. It's what happens next once you accept that they were made by people, in history, and you still think there's something in them worth keeping. Königsberg, 1793, a university town on the Baltic, on the eastern edge of Prussia. Kant's book came out in 4 parts, and the way it got into print tells you something about the temperature of the moment. 5 years earlier, in 1788, the Prussian minister Johann Christoph von Wöllner had issued a religion edict that tightened control over what clergy could preach and what could be printed on religious subjects. The first of Kant's 4 essays cleared the censor in Berlin and ran in a monthly journal. The second one was refused. What Kant did next was procedural and quietly brilliant. He argued that a work like his belonged to philosophy, not to biblical theology, that a philosopher examining the moral content of religious ideas is not doing the same job as a theologian ruling on doctrine, and shouldn't be judged by that faculty's standards. He got a reading from the theology faculty at Königsberg on that jurisdictional question, then took the manuscript to the philosophy faculty at Jena, which approved it. The book came out. A second edition followed the next year. And in October of 1794, an order arrived from the court of Friedrich William II, telling him to stop. He answered with a promise carefully worded as a subject of that king. When the king died 3 years later, Kant considered the promise expired and published the whole story himself. Set the drama aside, because the drama isn't the point and Kant is not the hero of this video. The argument is the point. Here is the shape of it, and it's the single most useful idea in this entire investigation. Kant asks you to picture two circles, one inside the other. The wider circle is what he calls ecclesiastical faith, church faith, meaning everything a particular tradition holds because of its specific history. Its scriptures, its rituals, its calendar, its stories about what happened, where, and to whom. The practices that make a Baptist and a Catholic a Catholic. The narrower circle inside it is what he calls pure religious faith, and it contains only what any human being could arrive at through moral reasoning alone, without needing to be told about any particular event. Now, the obvious guess about what he does with those two circles is the wrong one. And this is where Kant splits hard from Jefferson. He does not say, cut the outer circle away. He says, the outer circle is the vehicle. That's his word. The historical, particular, storied part of a religion is the thing that carries the moral core to actual human beings, who are not abstract reasoners but people with childhoods and grief and Tuesday afternoons. You cannot hand a person a bare principle and expect it to shape a life. It has to arrive inside something, a story they heard when they were 6, a song their grandmother sang, a room full of other people doing the same thing at the same hour on the same day of the week, which means Kant, of all people, is arguing that the shell is not a nuisance. It's the delivery system. The mistake he's targeting is much more specific, treating the vehicle as if it were the cargo, believing that the essential thing you owe is assent to the historical claims, rather than the moral life those claims exist to produce. And that reframing does something to Jefferson's razor. Jefferson kept the diamonds and threw out the rest. Kant would say, the rest is how the diamonds got to Virginia in the first place. If you've ever felt torn between the version of faith you can defend in an argument and the version that actually got into your bones through a hymn, that tension has a name and a 200-year-old literature, you're not confused. You're standing exactly where the philosophy stands. So then everything depends on the criterion. If the moral core is the cargo, how do you tell cargo from container? What's the test? Kant's answer is uncomfortable in a specific way that's worth stating plainly, because it's the hinge of his whole religious philosophy. His test is that a moral judgment you're certain of outranks a historical or supernatural claim you can't verify. He gives the sharpest possible example, and he picked the hardest story in the Hebrew Bible to do it. In a work he published in 1798, discussing how a person should respond to an alleged command from God, Kant takes up Abraham on the mountain, ordered to sacrifice his son Isaac. And he writes that Abraham should have answered the voice something like this, that I ought not to kill my good son is absolutely certain, but that you, who appear to me, are God, of that I am not certain and never could be. Read it twice. He isn't saying the story is fiction. He's making a claim about the order of certainties. The wrongness of killing your child is something you know as directly as you know anything. The identity of a voice claiming divine authority is a claim about the world that could always be mistaken. When the two collide, the one you can be certain of wins. Now, a lot of readers have found that reading violent, and they have a case. Søren Kierkegaard built an entire book around the opposite position, arguing that the whole religious power of that story lies precisely in the fact that it breaks the moral frame, and that Kant's version just deletes the mystery and hands you an ethics lecture. Jewish interpretation has wrestled with the binding of Isaac for 2,000 years in ways that are far richer than either. When you hear scholars say Kant flattens the text, that criticism is fair, and you should hold it alongside his argument rather than picking a side too fast. The rest of his positive proposal follows from that same criterion. Kant defines religion, and this is his own formulation, running through the book as the recognition of all our duties as divine commands. Look at what that sentence does. It doesn't say duties are whatever a divine command happens to be. It runs the other direction. What's genuinely a duty is what carries divine weight. The moral content isn't derived from the revelation. It's what lets you recognize a revelation as worth the name. Which brings us to the thing I'd be dishonest to skip. There's an ugly stretch in Kant's religion book. He argues that Judaism, as he understands it, isn't really a religion at all, but a system of political and statutory law. a claim that is a caricature that was already being answered in his own lifetime by Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin, and that scholars today, including plenty of Kant's admirers, name as one of the worst failures in the work. It matters here for a reason beyond fairness. It's a live demonstration of the very risk this video is circling. A thinker sets out to identify the universal moral core of religion, and what he identifies looks suspiciously like the tradition he grew up in, with everything else sorted downward. Hold on to that. It comes back with force in a few minutes, and it turns out to be the central problem of the entire 200-year experiment. If this is the kind of material you'd want a friend to have the actual documents, the actual criticisms, no shouting sending it to them is genuinely how it travels. That's not marketing. There's no algorithm that finds a person like a person does. Now watch this operation cross the Atlantic and turn into objects you can buy at a Christian bookstore. 19 years after Kant's book, and around the same years Jefferson was cutting up his Gospels, a Bengali scholar in Calcutta named Rammohun Roy published a small volume called The Precepts of Jesus, The Guide to Peace and Happiness. That was 1820. Roy read Sanskrit, Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, and English. He extracted the ethical teachings of Jesus, left out the miracles and the doctrinal claims, and argued that the moral content stood on its own and could speak to a Hindu reader without requiring conversion to any church's history. The Baptist missionaries at Serampore, a few miles up the river, were furious, and a long printed argument followed. Roy went on to found a reform movement that reshaped Hindu religious thought in the 19th century. That's the same experiment, run independently, on the other side of the planet, by someone from a completely different tradition, in the same decade. That should tell you something. The instinct to separate a moral core from an inherited shell isn't a Christian problem or a Western problem. It shows up wherever a tradition meets a mind that wants to know what part is load-bearing. Back home, the American versions took a form nobody thinks of as philosophy. 1899. A magazine editor in New York named Louis Klopsch, who ran the Christian Herald, had an idea. Print the words attributed to Jesus in red ink. The first red-letter New Testament ran 60,000 copies. 2 years later, he did the whole Bible. And it caught so completely that 125 years later, most American Christians assume red letters are just how a Bible looks. But think about what a red-letter Bible is. It's a typographical claim. Ink color making an argument about which words carry more weight. Jefferson used a razor. Klopsch used a printing press and left everything in place, which, in a way, is closer to Kant's solution than Jefferson's. Nothing gets cut. The container is fully intact. But the cargo is now marked. Then, 1989, Holland, Michigan. A youth leader named Janie Tinklenberg was trying to give her group something to keep the question of how to actually live in front of them during the week. She'd been thinking about a novel from 1896 by a Kansas minister named Charles Sheldon called In His Steps, in which a congregation agrees to ask, before every decision, what Jesus would do. She had a few hundred woven bracelets made, with 4 letters on them. By the mid-90s, those 4 letters were on wristbands, keychains, t-shirts, and book covers in every mall in America. Tens of millions of them. And here's what nobody at those youth group tables was told. That bracelet is a philosophical position. It compresses an entire religion into a single moral question. It says nothing about the incarnation, nothing about atonement theories, nothing about what happened on the 3rd day. It selects the ethical core and makes it portable enough to wear on your wrist in 8th grade. Kant would have recognized that bracelet instantly. Whether he'd have approved is a real question. He was wary of anything that turns morality into a rule you follow because of who's watching. But the operation is his. The moral heart, lifted out and handed over. If you wore one of those, you were doing German critical philosophy at a lock-in with pizza and a Newsboys CD. Nobody told you that either. Back to Germany. Because in 1835, the experiment produced the book that broke the 19th century open. David Friedrich Strauss was 27 years old, teaching at the seminary in Tübingen, and he published 2 thick volumes called The Life of Jesus, Critically Examined. His central move was a category, and the category was myth. Now, that word does a lot of damage in ordinary English, so be careful with it. Strauss did not mean lie. He did not mean somebody made it up to fool you. He meant something closer to this. A community with deep expectations, shaped by its own scriptures, remembering a figure it loved, will naturally tell the story of that figure in the shapes its expectations provide, not by conspiring, by being human. The way a family story about a grandfather gets rounder and more meaningful across 3 generations, without anyone, at any point, deciding to lie. Applied across the Gospels, that idea reorganized everything. Where earlier critics had tried to explain miracles away with natural causes, the walking on water was a sandbar, the feeding of the multitude was people sharing hidden lunches, which is genuinely what some of them argued. Strauss said the whole approach was wrong. These aren't garbled reports of odd events. They're theological statements told as narrative, and the right question is what they mean, not what physically occurred. It cost him immediately. He lost his teaching position at Tübingen. A few years later, Zurich offered him a chair, the public erupted, and the university pensioned him off before he ever taught a class. And the way that book reached the English-speaking world is one of the great small facts of literary history. It was translated in 1846 by a young Englishwoman named Marian Evans, who published it anonymously. She'd later write Middlemarch under the name George Eliot. Strauss was her first published book. She worked on it for 2 years and said it made her ill. Then it reached America, though America had already gotten there on its own. July of 1838, 3 years after Strauss, Ralph Waldo Emerson stood up in the chapel at Harvard Divinity School to address the graduating class of 6 students. He told them that what he called historical Christianity had fallen into an error that corrupts every attempt to communicate religion that it dwells with what he called noxious exaggeration on the person of Jesus. Instead of on the moral sentiment that Jesus was pointing at, he said the miracle talk had been made into a monster because it had been cut off from the ordinary miracle of a life and a rainstorm and clover in a field. The reaction was severe enough that Harvard did not invite him back for roughly 30 years. 6 graduating students in a chapel in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1838, and the argument in that room is the same argument that was running in Königsberg, in Hamburg, at Monticello, and in Calcutta. That's not coincidence, and it's not influence tracing gone wild. It's what happens when a tradition's historical claims come under sustained examination, and its adherents have to decide what they were holding on to all along. If your own version of this arrived as a slow, private unease rather than a public address that's not a lesser version of the question, it's the same question, asked at the scale where it actually costs something. Which brings us to the objection. And the strongest objection to the whole separation experiment came from inside it, from people who had spent their careers running it. 1906, Albert Schweitzer, who was a New Testament scholar before he was anything else, published a survey of the entire 150 years of scholarship we've just walked through. He traced it from Reimarus forward, and his verdict was devastating in the most polite possible way. He showed that each generation of critics, digging beneath the historical shell to recover the real teacher underneath, kept recovering a figure who shared that generation's values. The rationalists found a rational teacher. The romantics found a romantic one. The liberal Protestants of the 1800s found a liberal Protestant. An Irish theologian named George Tyrrell put it in the image that stuck. Writing in 1909 about one of the great German scholars, he said, "The Christ that Harnack sees, looking back through 19 centuries of Catholic darkness, is only the reflection of a liberal Protestant face, seen at the bottom of a deep well." That's the problem in one sentence. You lower yourself down the shaft to see what's really at the bottom, and what looks back at you is your own face. And you can check the charge against the record. Jefferson's extracted Jesus is a plain-spoken moral teacher who dislikes priests and elaborate doctrine, which is a fair description of Thomas Jefferson. Kant's essential religion turns out to be duty performed for its own sake, which is Kant's ethics. Emerson's Jesus is a transcendentalist. Strauss's is a figure whose importance is the idea he embodies, which is Hegelian philosophy, which is what Strauss was trained in.